In the spring of 33 AD, on a hillside outside Jerusalem called Golgotha, a mother watched her son die. She stood close enough to see the nails. She stood close enough to hear him breathe. And when it was finished, when the soldiers had gone and the crowd had dissolved back into the city, she was still standing there. The Gospels record that moment with terrible brevity. What they do not record, what no single scripture names in full, is what came next. Not the next hour, the next 30 years. Stay with this one to the end, because every detail is here for a reason. Her name was Mary. She had been raising this particular child since she was 16, maybe 17 years old, in a stone and mud brick house in Nazareth, in the hill country of Lower Galilee. She had ground grain for him. She had wrapped him in linen. She had walked 80 miles to Bethlehem while her body carried him, and she had walked home again. She had done all of this without fully understanding what she was carrying. And then for 30 years, she had watched him become what the angel had promised. And then she had watched him die. What the Bible does not explain is what a woman does with the rest of her life after that. Picture her in the hours after the crucifixion. The lamplight is low. The room is in Jerusalem, borrowed, unfamiliar. The air smells of stone and of the particular grief that has no name, the grief that comes when you have not merely lost someone but have witnessed the manner of their losing. The disciples are gathered, but they are shattered men, and she is not a shattered woman. She is something quieter than shattered. She has been prepared for this longer than any of them. Luke chapter 2 records that when Simeon the prophet held the infant Jesus in the temple and said, "A sword will pierce your own soul." Mary had stored that word in her body for 33 years. She had been carrying the wound before the wound arrived. The first thing the record gives us after the resurrection is her presence in the upper room. Acts chapter 1 verse 14. Luke names her specifically, by name, among the disciples gathered in prayer in Jerusalem, not as a mourner on the margins, as a member of the community, present, persisting, there. She was perhaps in her late 40s by then, perhaps 50. The scholars debate the precise years of her birth, but the arithmetic places her somewhere in that range. What is not debated is that she was there, praying, still. Follow her into those early years of the movement in Jerusalem. The church, as Acts describes it, was not a building. It was a network of households, families who opened their homes, shared their tables, and gathered around the memory of what they had seen. Mary moved inside that network. She was not a peripheral figure. She was the one person in the community who had known Jesus longer than anyone else alive, who had known him not as Rabbi or risen Lord, but as the infant who had cried in the night, as the 12-year-old who had frightened her in the temple, as the man who had looked at her from the cross and said, as recorded in John chapter 19, "Woman, behold your son," and had given her into the care of the beloved disciple John. That transfer was not a small thing. It was a household arrangement. From that moment, John chapter 19 records plainly, John took her into his own home. So she lived in John's household. And here is where the silence becomes its own kind of evidence. The early church fathers, Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, and later Eusebius, record a tradition that John eventually settled in Ephesus, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, on the Aegean Sea. Ephesus was not a small village. It was one of the largest cities in the Roman world, perhaps 200,000 people at its height, a city of marble colonnades and crowded harbors, and a pagan temple to Artemis that was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The tradition is old and persistent enough that by the 4th century, Christians in Ephesus were venerating a specific site as the house where Mary had lived in her final years. That site, on a hillside called Bulbuldah, 7 miles outside the city, has been excavated and visited continuously since the 19th century. Whether or not the stone foundations there are truly hers, the tradition beneath them is ancient. Mary, the mother of Jesus, may have spent the final decades of her life on a hillside above the Aegean. in a city that had never heard the name Nazareth until John brought it there. Picture what those years in Ephesus would have held. She still woke before dawn. She still kept the rhythms of Jewish prayer. The Shema, the blessing over bread, the Sabbath lamp lit at dusk on Friday. She still carried the same hands that had swaddled him in Bethlehem, that had steadied him at a carpenter's bench, that had last touched his body when they wrapped him for burial. Every meal, every Sabbath, every morning prayer in a city that smelled of salt water and cedar resin and the smoke of foreign altars. The domestic faithfulness did not stop because the public story was over. It simply continued, quieter, in a different place. And here is what the scholars observe about those years. Paul's letters, written through the 50s AD, contain no greetings to Mary, not in the letter to the Romans, not in the letters to the Corinthians, not in any of the 13 letters that carry his name. If she had been in Jerusalem when Paul was active there, it is difficult to imagine him not mentioning her. Her absence from his correspondence is itself a kind of data. It suggests that by the time Paul's letter-writing years arrived, Mary was no longer in Jerusalem. She had moved. And the oldest tradition places her movement toward John, toward Ephesus, toward the western edge of the known world. The Dormition, the tradition of her death, is not in the New Testament. It is the Church's oldest extra-biblical memory, preserved in texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Texts like the Transitus Mariae, which are not scripture, but are not nothing either. They are the community's attempt to honor a story that the Gospels had left unfinished. The tradition says that the disciples gathered around her at the end, that she died peacefully, in prayer, in old age, that she was buried, and that what happened to her body after burial became the earliest seed of the doctrine of the Assumption. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions hold that she was taken bodily into heaven, a doctrine formally defined for Catholics only in 1950, but rooted in a reverence that stretches back to the 2nd century. The Protestant traditions are quieter on this point, but even they do not dispute the central fact. She lived a long life after the crucifixion, and she died having seen the movement her son started become a force that was already shaking the Roman world. Step back for a moment. Let the arithmetic settle. If Mary was roughly 15 to 17 at the birth of Jesus, and if Jesus died at approximately age 33, she was in her late 40s or early 50s at the time of his death. The ancient sources suggest she lived to somewhere between 60 and 80 years of age. That means she had, conservatively, 20 to 30 years of life after Golgotha, 20 to 30 years of prayer, of testimony, of presence in a community that was being built from nothing. 20 to 30 years of being the one person alive who could say, with her body as evidence, that the story had begun in a stable and that she had been there. Think about what she carried in those years that no one else could carry. Every mother of the disciples knew her son's public ministry. Only Mary knew the private 30 years before it. She knew the sound of his voice learning to speak. She knew the particular way he held a tool. She knew what he looked like at 12, at 20, at the moment he left Nazareth and did not come home again in the way he had always come home before. She was the living archive of the hidden years, the years that the Gospels compress into a single verse in Luke chapter 2. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature, and in favor with God and man. One verse, 30 years. And she had been there for every day of them. The early church did not waste that archive. The Magnificat, her great hymn of praise recorded in Luke chapter 1, was sung in Christian worship within decades of her death and has been sung without interruption for 2,000 years. The infancy narratives in both Matthew and Luke almost certainly draw on testimony that could only have come from her: the Annunciation, the visit to Elizabeth, the shepherds, the Magi, the presentation in the temple, the flight to Egypt. Luke chapter 2 says twice that Mary kept all these things, pondering them in her heart. She was not simply a witness. She was the keeper of the record. And then, at some point on a hillside in Ephesus or in Jerusalem, or in a place the record does not name, the lamp went out. She had carried the story from a stable in Bethlehem to the end of her own life, and she had not dropped it once. The Bible's silence about those 30 years is not an absence. It is the shape of a woman who kept going after the worst thing had happened, who prayed in a borrowed room in Jerusalem, and then in a house above the Aegean, and then wherever the next day required her to be. She did not perform her grief. She did not demand to be seen. She kept the rhythms, the bread, the lamp, the morning prayer, and she let the faithfulness do what faithfulness does, which is outlast everything that tries to end it. Some things do not need to be recorded to be real. Some things are preserved exactly because someone, somewhere, kept going long after the world stopped watching. If this changed how you picture her, share it with a mother who is tired tonight. She may need to see it. Drop a comment and tell me what hit you hardest. Was it those 30 years of quiet prayer? The possibility of Ephesus? Or the thought that she was the living archive of everything the Gospels didn't write down? I read every comment. See you in the next one.